Hey, welcome back. I'm Carissa and I'm doing my Master Gardener's training, and I have started a whole series on this, so if you are interested in the previous episodes, I will link it in the description below. Today's episode is all about herbaceous plants. This was a really interesting topic for me. It wasn't just, the definition of what is a herbaceous plant. I think most gardeners know what that is. But it really dived into the care, the maintenance, different factors to consider when you're choosing your herbaceous plants, how to design with herbaceous plants, and all that type of thing. I really enjoyed this presentation. Again, another fantastic presenter. All the presenters for all the different topics have been phenomenal. And I'm really enjoying it. Okay, so the definition of a herbaceous plant would be anything non-woody, right? If we're thinking about our shrubs and trees, those are not herbaceous perennials. Another way to describe it would be that above ground growth would die back in the winter in temperate climates, right? So if you live in the northern hemisphere, a lot of your plants will be dying back above the ground, but then that lower level underneath the soil is what's living, right? So that would be a bulb that is storing the nutrients and the food for next year. That would be your root system, the part of the plant that's still living under the soil. And that would be the definition of a herbaceous plant. And then from that definition, plants are further grouped into different categories. So the ones we as gardeners are familiar with would be annuals, biennials, and perennials. So an annual would complete its life cycle in less than a year or less than a year. So we are very familiar with those. You're starting them from seed that very year. They are growing, producing seed, and dying in the same year. Give or take a bit. And then a biennial would be something that completes its life cycle in 2 years, right? So the first year it's focused on root development and foliage, and then the next year is when it produces the flower typically and sets seed to continue the life cycle. A perennial's definition would be anything that lasts 3 or more years, right? And we can have short-lived perennials and we can have long-lived perennials, right? Like you think of a peony. They've been around, some of them maybe for almost 100 years. Typically 50 years is the life expectancy of a peony, right? They can be very long living. And then you have your perennial scabioses, right? Those are maybe only 3 to 5 years life expectancy. Herbaceous plants are then grouped further. We can consider things like environmental needs, right? Do they need a dry environment? Do they prefer shady or alpine or woodland? All these different sort of categories that they are grouped in. Another way to be grouped would be their growth habit. We've got our climbers, our ramblers, our clumpers, spreaders, and all those different types of categories within their growth habit. They're also grouped in their taxonomy groups, their classifications, right? We've got our ferns, our grasses, our cacti, and they can be grouped in that way as well. Okay, there was a little segment in our presentation about the history of gardening, and I love history, I don't know about you, but it does also help us to understand sort of the trends that have kind of come and gone throughout the years. A lot of design in gardening has been based on history and what's been going on in the world. So it's really interesting for me to sort of understand that sort of dynamic. Our earliest idea of gardening was the early civilization. So that was 8,000 to 2000 BC. So many years ago, right? And there is evidence of gardening way back then, which is super interesting to me. And not just for survival. There was beautiful gardens in the ancient times, and it's really interesting to look back at that. And from there we have our medieval, which is a lot of medicinal plants were starting to be of interest to people, and then the Arabic and the Asian gardens, right? Like Japanese gardens, that type of thing. And those are very interesting to look back at. It's just insane to see the design and the simplicity of some of those Asian gardens. And from there, gardening started to get a little bit more common, especially after some of those wars, the world wars. We have the European gardening sort of scene starting to take shape. Italian gardens, French, English cottage gardens, all of the ones we're probably a little bit more familiar. Those were all starting around the 1800s to 1900s. And also during the presentation, it was shared that the price of glass was coming down, the tax on glass was coming down. So greenhouses were all of a sudden a little bit more affordable. So it was becoming a hobby for people to do their own little greenhouse gardening. It was becoming easier or more tangible for a home gardener to have a greenhouse and propagate and grow in a protected space, which is really interesting. And then we come to the modern or contemporary age, which is what we are in now. So that would be the mid 1900s to present times now. And you know, there are very, very modern gardens out there, and there are a lot of modern gardeners out there, a lot of landscape architects that design these really interesting modern gardens, which is actually so different than nature if you think about it, which is really interesting for the eye. Some of these design changes, like I said, have taken place because of our education and our knowledge about what our climate needs, right? Drought tolerant gardening, resilient gardening is becoming more of a trend. People are trying to plant more based on their environment instead of sort of creating some sort of exotic garden in their yard, right? We're being a little bit more mindful about what conditions maybe our properties want and would thrive in, instead of sort of creating this habitat that's sort of very unlike our natural habitat. So all of these design changes sort of changed throughout the year, and now where we're at, like I said, is more of the modern times. It's obviously very easy to get our hands on many different plants, so we can have a wide variety of different styles within our gardens. And it's just a matter of finding what works for you, I think, and sort of deciding what kind of challenges you want to take on and which challenges you don't want to take on. Okay, and then it was discussed the advantages of growing herbaceous plants in your garden and some of the disadvantages. And I think we're probably pretty aware of most of these, but I'll go through my list anyway. So obviously fast to mature, right? Our herbaceous plants sort of grow quickly in the season compared to a shrub or a tree, right? They're easy to mature. Another thing would be typically they're easy to propagate, right? A lot of grasses sort of clump and then you can divide them. A lot of the root systems can be sort of broken apart. They're typically pretty easy to propagate. Another advantage would be that they're very showy and rewarding, right? Their bloom time is a little bit longer than a shrub or a tree. So you're getting a little bit more interest in the season than you would have had with a woody plant. This could be an advantage or a disadvantage that they do tend to be smaller than your shrubs and trees. But for an advantage of this is that you can fit more into your garden, right? You can have a lot more interest because they're typically about 3 feet max wide, so you can fit a lot more into your garden and thus have more variety. Okay, the last advantage that I was given for herbaceous plants would be that they are easy to move or change, right? Their roots sort of stay a little bit tidier. You can dig them out, you can move them over and sort of play with them if you feel like it. Okay, some of the disadvantages of growing herbaceous plants. They have more maintenance, right? They need to be deadheaded, they need to be pruned and cleaned up after the season. A lot of different things need to happen to grow a herbaceous plant in your garden. They are more susceptible to weed competition. So they do stay sort of in their area a little bit more. They don't have the tendency to shade out your garden like a shrub or a tree would, which sometimes would deter weeds. So there is a little bit more weed pressure when you're growing herbaceous plants. Another factor to consider is that they're not always long-lived, like I discussed in our grouping categories, right? Perennials and biennials and annuals. Some of them are very short-lived, right? So it's a consideration if you're wanting to always be replanting. Maybe you don't, maybe you want more of a hands-off approach. Maybe woody shrubs would be a little bit easier to manage and just sort of have a consistent garden look. So depending on if you are leaving your herbaceous plants in the garden in the winter, they can add a little bit of winter interest. But if you're the type that wants to clean it all up before winter comes, you might lack a little bit of interest, right? So that's another thing to consider. Okay, and then we have our ephemerals, which are like the bulbs that sort of go dormant, right? So that can look a little bit unsightly, right? That would be a deterrent to having them in your garden. If you really can't stand that browning leaf of the tulip or the daffodil, it's something to consider if you want to stay away from that look in your garden. But one thing to consider would be to plant other herbaceous plants that sort of mature after your ephemerals. So you could plant, echinacea around it, and that would sort of cover those browning leaves, and maybe it wouldn't look so unsightly for you. And then setting seed, right? So some of our annuals, some of our perennials, and even biennials will set seed. And that could be an advantage or a disadvantage, obviously. If you really like that plant and you want it to take over, self-seeding is a wonderful thing. But if you really don't love the wild cottage look and you want your plants to stay in one spot, a herbaceous plant does, some of them do tend to self-seed, so it's another thing to consider. During our presentation, the presenter shared a quote, and I couldn't find the exact quote, but I found another one, and it was just sort of a call to action, right? As gardeners, understanding how these things grow really benefits us and benefits our garden, not only in look, but function and practicality. It was really encouraging to us to just get out there, observe your garden, spend time with your garden, watch how it changes in the season, and it really will help you understand your garden and produce a more abundant garden and a more pleasing garden as well. So I found a similar quote online, and it's Russell Page. He was a gardener or a landscape architect actually in the early 1900s. And it's, "If you wish to make anything grow, you must understand it, and understand it in a very real sense. Green fingers are a fact and a mystery only to the unpracticed, but green fingers are the extension of a verdant heart." And I think it's really beneficial for us to sort of think like, not all of us are born with green thumbs. Actually, we're not born with green thumbs, right? It takes experience, it takes practice, it takes failure, and all of those things. And I really appreciated just that sort of perspective on gardening. Okay, so now that you understand what a herbaceous plant is, I'm sure you did before, you are going to the store and you want to select the best plant you can for your garden. The first thing to consider when you're choosing your plant is buy from a reliable source, a trusted nursery. The big box stores tend to just, put them out there and not really take care of them. The local nurseries will be a little bit more informed. The labels on the plants might be a little bit more informative as well, and the care for them might be a little bit better as well. So you might start with a healthier plant when you're buying it from a local nursery. So bringing home a healthy plant is the best way to start your garden, right? If you're already trying to nurse this plant and kind of bring it back to life, it's going to be a bit of a challenge anyway. And if you're buying from a local nursery that has a good reputation, you are less likely to bring home pests or diseases, just a healthier plant in general. Another thing to consider would be buying your plant when it's not in bloom. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to bloom, and your plant will be very, very tired after it's done blooming or while it's blooming. So buying it before it starts blooming or after and deadheading those blooms is a very good idea, just to get your plant the strongest as possible when you are planting it out, because it does take a certain amount of energy to reestablish its root system once it's planted. Okay, some of us have bought clearance plants, and sometimes they're a very, very, very good idea. You can sometimes get a bargain at the end of the season and just bring home amazing amounts of plants for little amounts of money. But sometimes there is a risk involved, right? If you are buying it from a big box store, maybe that plant is diseased or it has some pests. That's something to consider. And also, it might be a tough go. It might be a big challenge to get that plant healthy again. So just weighing your risks and rewards when you're choosing your plant, and if there are clearance plants, and just deciding what you're willing to do for that plant. Something that wasn't discussed, but it was just brought to my mind, the size of your plant, right? We can get a bargain when we're buying a small, maybe 4-inch pot. But knowing what the life cycle of that plant is and how fast it takes to get established is something to keep in mind as well, right? If we want big bang for our buck, you can buy many 4-inch little pots, sometimes even 2-inch pots, and just get a ton of quantity, right? But some of those plants might take a long time to get established, so it's something to consider. I know with peonies, if you're getting 2 or 3 eyes on your bare root peony, it's going to take a long time to get some of those blooms, right? Usually they take at least 2 or 3 years to get established once they're planted. But if you're starting with a 4 or 5 eye peony bare root, you're likely to get blooms a little bit sooner. So all of those things to consider when you're purchasing your plant. Okay, so you purchased your healthy plant, you have brought it home, you are ready to plant. How do we plant our herbaceous plants? I think most of this is pretty intuitive, but here's a few more tips. Lay it out in its pot where you want it to be in the garden, just to preview it, right? It's a lot of work to dig it, and it's a lot of stress on the plant if you're going to move it along, or if you're going to move it around a lot, right? So it's easier to just sort of put the plant in its pot where you want it and sort of stand back and give it a look and see if that's where you want it for its home. I've done this, and I've played around so much with it, just putting them in different spots and considering, the light, how it comes, how these plants are going to mature. And I think it really has saved myself a lot of time in replanting them. Okay, so we're going to be watering our plant twice while planting. So prior to planting, you want to water your plant when it's in its pot, just to make sure those roots are not dry, right? A dry root is not a good idea for a plant. And then once it is planted, you are going to water it in well, and that'll help not only the roots, but it'll also help the soil sort of settle around the root system and create a nice home for that plant. Planting depth, most of us know, a typical plant doesn't want the crown to be buried. You're right, you could get some rot there. And you also don't want the roots exposed. So that happy medium in between. And a good way to follow that would be the depth that it's planted in its pot is typically, again, if you're buying it from a reliable source, the depth that it's in its pot is where you probably want to make sure your soil is in your home garden. Okay, and give your plant a break. Don't be planting it in the hot or dry periods of your growing season. It causes a lot of stress on those plants, right? If they're not only, their roots are exposed and moved about, but then they're also going to be in super hot or dry periods. It just causes a lot of stress on that plant. So it's best to plant it when it's maybe in the evening after the sun has gone down. Maybe if you're going to get a couple overcast days, that would be a great time to plant. Okay, another thing that would help your plant is to tease the roots, right? We've all sort of brought our plant home and exposed the root system, and it's just this root-bound plant, right? It's a little bit of a shock to see how many roots are in that pot sometimes. But a good idea is to release the plant from its pots and sort of grab the bottom and rip the bottom roots. And that will help break up the root system, and it won't hurt the plant at all. It's actually healthy for the plant to get a little bit of root breakage. And if your plant isn't too root bound, just teasing the roots on the outer edge would probably help it as well, just to sort of break up its sort of pattern of growth for the root system, and I think it'll do well. And our presenter brought up one of the sort of misconceptions that we sort of tend to think about when we're wanting to help our plants. And the interesting fact he shared with us is shearing back your plant or removing some of the leaf or branch growth when you're planting doesn't actually help it establish its root system, right? We are under the false idea that removing some of those leaves will help the plant to focus its energy on the root development, when in fact the hormones needed for root development are produced in those leaves. So don't cut back your plant to save energy for root development. That is a misconception, and it is not helpful for your plant. Okay, and speaking of removing leaves and branches, that takes me to the maintenance of pruning, disbudding, pinching, shearing, leaf thinning, and deadheading. So these are all terms within care of your herbaceous plant, but there are different benefits and functions of these practices. So all of these practices are removing a portion, usually the stems, to control growth or to prevent seeds. We can be reducing our height, we can be increasing stabilization, promote rejuvenation, and removing spent growth. So those are all just different names for things that we do for our herbaceous plants, right? Deadheading would be after that plant has produced its beautiful blooms, removing the spent blooms in order to get it to either produce more flowers or to prevent the seed spread or to remove unsightly dead growth. Okay, and then that brings me to a polarizing topic, and I just want to say you do you. There are two ways to do your seasonal cleanup for your herbaceous plants. Some people will clean up in the fall. Some people will clean up in the fall, and some people will clean up in the spring. There is no right or wrong way to do this. I think it depends on a lot of different factors, your climate, your environment, your calendar. All these different things are a consideration for when you should be doing your garden cleanup. Okay, so you are team leave it. You don't want to touch it until the spring. That is what you want to do, and these are the reasons why you want to do that. Aesthetics. You think leaving your beautiful plants in the winter provides interest, and I would be in that category. I would be in that team as well. I do like seeing the sort of seed heads and branches out in the winter. Another advantage would be pest and disease. So it creates a habitat for your beneficials and also promotes biodiversity. A lot of insects will create a habitat in those herbaceous plants, usually the stems of the plant. They will use it for a habitat, and it does promote biodiversity, right? You're encouraging them to stick around, to come back in the spring and do what they need to do in order to help with your pests that you don't want around. And leaving your branches out in the winter also produces food for the birds, and the seed heads are beautiful to look at, like I said, but it also produces a source of food. Another reason why you want to leave your branches out in the winter, for ease of cleanup. A lot of the matter will decay, and that means there will be less for you to clean up in the springtime. Okay, you are team seasonal cleanup. You want to do that as soon as it's fall, as soon as things get a little bit unsightly. That is your preference. Some of the advantages to being on that team would be a tidier appearance, right? Like maybe you don't want those branches sort of haphazardly popping up in your garden underneath the snow. Maybe that's not the look you're going for and you want a tidier appearance. Another would be to remove possible overwintering pests, right? Like I said, beneficials can overwinter, but also the pests that you don't want. So if you are having a ton of pest pressure for insects that can overwinter, maybe it's a consideration for you to do some fall cleanup to stop those specific insects from overwintering. And the same would be for disease, right? If you're dealing with a very persistent disease, maybe cleanup would be a good idea for you. Okay, and the last advantage would be it's easier to work in, right? If you are the type of gardener who's still doing a lot of work in the fall and winter, maybe you don't want those branches in your way and you want to remove some of that growth just to make sure that you have an area to work in. Well, that is my summary on herbaceous plants. There is a whole lot more I could be speaking about. If you are interested, I encourage you to do some searches on the internet and really dive into this topic. It is a huge topic. The way the presenter closed this topic was sharing some of his favorite herbaceous perennials, so I thought that I would do the same. So here is an image of some of my favorites, and it was very hard to choose some of my favorites. These are also the ones I only have photos of too. So some of my actual favorites might not be on this list, but here's just a few, just offhand favorites. So I've got echinacea. There are numerous benefits to having echinacea in your garden, right? Pollinators, birds. It's a little bit more drought tolerant. I deal with that kind of issue in my climate. And it's just a beautiful, stunning flower. And the bloom time is very long as well. Another one would be Veronica. That's that top picture. And any sort of spike too, right? I love salvia. I love Veronica. All of those types of spike really add a nice interest in your garden. I also love daffodils. They are just so beautiful. They are deer resistant, they naturalize, and I think they're just such a beautiful, full sort of like pop of hope. After a long winter, they are the first thing to come out. I think they're often overlooked because they are a little bit more of a simple structure of a flower, but I really love daffodils. Purple plant here I have is Nepeta, and I think this is Walker's Low, and it has been a dream to grow in my garden. It just grows almost like a small shrub. And it blooms twice in the year, and I just really enjoy growing it in my garden, and it's just such a beautiful subtle color, and it's a replacement for lavender for me. Lavender doesn't do well in our area, so Nepeta is the next best thing for me. And then I have zinnias. Zinnias are just such an easy cut flower to grow, and I really enjoy their look. They're just such a beautiful flower. Dahlias are very similar in my opinion, just that tidy, round, beautiful floret, just so beautiful, and dahlias are definitely one of my favorites as well. And then at the bottom I have Haliopsis bleeding hearts, and this was a new plant to me, I think about 2 years ago, and the first year I grew it, I just fell in love. It's just such an easy plant to grow. Again, deer resistant. I think it's a little bit more drought tolerant as well. Blooms throughout the growing season, and I just really enjoy the flowers, and they smell very good as well. All right, this is a huge topic, and I think I'm going to get further into it as my Master Gardener training progresses. I think we actually do have a whole presentation on landscape architecture and design, so stay tuned for that. But this presenter did talk a little bit about designing for effective use, and I really enjoyed his thought process on this. So he said, do it personal, right? Think of the gardens that you really enjoy visiting, maybe pictures you've seen online, maybe your grandma's garden, like what really stood out to you and what personally spoke to you in those gardens, right? Because I think copying other gardeners can be effective as well, but long term, it's not going to have that sort of emotional draw that we have when it's really, when you're really thinking about what specifically is speaking to you in that garden. Okay, and then he said to start with form, texture, and color. So those are the basics of designing with herbaceous plants, right? You're talking about form. Is it an upright plant, right? Does it give you that sort of spiky texture like a grass? Or if you're looking closer, is it like a snapdragon, right? It still gives you that sort of upright texture. And then a rounding plant, right? If you're thinking about Artemisia, Artemisia definitely stays in sort of a rounding mound pattern. And it just sort of softens the look of your garden, right? All of these different sort of elements of design, they sort of provoke an emotion within us, right? That rounding is soft and calming. That upright is sort of unexpected and it draws our eye. And then you have your spreaders within form, right? The plants that sort of have a long and narrow sort of look, and they're just sort of calming, and they provide repetition in the garden and structure. And then within texture, that's a huge category as well, right? You've got spiky, you've got soft, you've got sort of a coarse look, you've got sort of a feathery type of leaf. There's all these different textures that you can add to your garden, and I think adding a lot can give you a certain look, but also holding back and using restraint within texture can give you a different look as well. And then color. You can look at a color wheel and do, complementary colors. You can do a monochromatic color scheme for your garden. You can try and stay in the color families. If you prefer cool tones, you can stay in the cool blues and purples. If you really like hot and exciting colors, you can do reds and oranges and yellows. All of these different things to consider. So looking at a site like Pinterest, right, and then looking at these gardens and deciding what form they have, what texture, what color palettes they have, really gives us a head start when we're designing our own gardens, right? Instead of just saying, oh, that's a pleasing picture, but really looking at what goes into that garden to make it pleasing to your eye specifically. Because this is an art, right? It is very subjective to our personal taste and what is pleasing to ourselves. Once you have done form, texture, and color, then you can move into repetition, variety, balance, emphasis, scale, and symmetry. So those are all parts of design and considerations when you want to be creating your garden. I was so happy that this topic of designing with herbaceous plants was brought up, because I am going to be planning a new garden come spring, or actually I'm planning it now, but I will be building this new garden in the spring. So I'm really excited to have this sort of information and wealth of knowledge when it comes to designing with herbaceous plants. All right, well, that is a huge topic. I encourage you to delve further into it. My goal is just to present an overview of what my training looks like in the Master Gardener program. So I hope that was informative. I hope it was interesting. Our next episode will be on woody plants. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.